Have you ever wondered why jobs are plentiful one year, but incredibly scarce the next? Or why a dollar today buys only a fraction of what it bought, say, 50 years ago? Well, let's get right into it. Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to decode the massive macroeconomic forces shaping our daily lives into a highly structured, easy-to-follow masterclass. Today, we're literally taking the entire global economy, placing it on the workbench, and examining exactly how its gears turn.
To do that, we've broken today's agenda down into 5 core mini-classes. We'll start with the 3 macro models, move into measuring economic output, tackle aggregate supply and demand, explore the Phillips curve trade-off, and finally wrap up with sticky wages and economic shocks.
So, jumping right into part 1, the 3 macro models.
Before we do anything else, we have to talk about potential GDP. This represents the absolute maximum capacity of our economic engine. Just imagine a massive, nationwide factory where every single machine is running perfectly and every willing worker is employed and highly productive. That's your potential GDP. It's the absolute ceiling of what we can produce given our current technology and resources.
Now, macroeconomics actually use completely different analytical lenses depending on the time frame they're looking at. In the very long run, which spans decades, nothing matters much except technological breakthroughs and capital accumulation. That's what actually doubles a nation's standard of living over time. In the long run, our productive capacity is largely fixed, meaning supply alone determines our total output. But here's the kicker. In the short run, prices are rigid. It's aggregate demand, meaning how much people actually want to buy, that dictates output and causes those painful recessions or thrilling economic booms.
So, a quick summary to lock in part 1. Short-run output is driven by demand, while the long run is constrained by supply capacity. Whenever you hear about a sudden economic crisis on the news, you're almost always looking at short-run demand problems. But if you're wondering why one country is fundamentally wealthier than another over a 50-year span, well, you're looking at long-run growth theory.
Moving right along to part 2, measuring our economic output.
Think of gross domestic product, or GDP, like a super relatable pie-baking economy. Picture this. Your friends are the labor, a rented kitchen is your capital, and the baked pie is your final output. This analogy takes the incredibly abstract, multi-trillion-dollar concept of GDP and brings it right down to earth. Because every economy, no matter how vast, is ultimately just combining labor and capital to produce final goods.
Okay, so how do we slice that pie? We can intuitively see how this total GDP pie is sliced into what we call factor payments. You've got wages for your friends, rent for the kitchen, and whatever is left is your entrepreneurial profit. When you produce something, the value of that output doesn't just vanish into thin air, right? It gets paid back out to the factors of production. In the real world, about 3/4 of these factor payments go to labor in the form of wages, and the rest mostly goes to capital. Now, if you memorize literally one equation in economics, make it this one. Y equals C plus I plus G plus NX. The GDP formula breaks down real-world demand into 4 distinct buckets: consumption, investment, government purchases, and net exports. It tells you exactly who is buying the pies we just baked. Is it everyday consumers, investing businesses, the government, or foreign buyers?
To sum up part 2, just remember that GDP is the sum of all factor payments and total demand. And, critically, nominal GDP measures value in today's shifting dollar values, while real GDP strips out the illusion of inflation. Real GDP is what gives us the true, accurate measure of physical output growth over time.
All right, part 3, aggregate supply and demand.
At its core, aggregate supply is simply what firms are willing to produce, while aggregate demand is what the market wants to buy. But unlike a single market for, say, apples or smartphones, this represents the entire macroeconomy. We're talking all goods, all services, all at once, reacting together to the overall national price level. And here is where we get to the really big debate in economics. The Keynesian short run assumes demand drives output. That means if you give people stimulus checks, idle factories turn back on, and unemployed workers get hired without instantly hiking prices. The supply curve is basically flat. But the classical long run assumes a vertical curve where capacity is totally fixed. In the long run, once everyone is already working, pumping up demand just causes massive inflation because, well, you literally can't produce any more than you already are.
So to wrap up Module 3, remember this: expansionary policies can boost output in the short run, but they only inflate prices in the long run. This is exactly why managing the economy is so incredibly tricky. You can hit the gas pedal to escape a recession today for sure, but if you hold that pedal down too long, you're just going to overheat the engine and get runaway inflation tomorrow.
Which brings us nicely to Part 4, the Phillips curve trade-off.
The famous Phillips curve demonstrates an inverse relationship between the rate of unemployment and the rate of wage inflation. And, it intuitively makes total sense. When jobs are plentiful and workers are scarce, employers literally have to bid up wages to attract talent. So the lower the unemployment rate, the faster prices seem to rise.
Historically, policymakers thought they had a fixed menu based on this curve. They thought, hey, accept a little inflation and we can guarantee low unemployment. But the real world proved to be way more complicated. That simple menu was completely torn to shreds in the 1970s, before being modernized later by the rational expectations revolution.
And that brings us to a massive economic pothole known as stagflation. Think back to the 1970s oil crisis. People were losing their jobs left and right, yet prices at the gas pump were skyrocketing. It was the painful, simultaneous combo of high unemployment and high inflation. So how is this even possible? It all comes down to human expectations. If workers and firms expect high inflation to continue, they build it right into their wage contracts and prices. That creates a self-fulfilling prophecy, even if the economy itself is entirely stagnant.
The key takeaway for Part 4 is that the unemployment-inflation trade-off is really only an illusion because human expectations eventually adapt. Once people catch on to the fact that inflation is rising, they demand higher wages to compensate for it. Therefore, you just cannot permanently lower unemployment simply by printing money and accepting higher inflation. It doesn't work out in the end.
Finally, let's dive into Part 5, sticky wages and shocks.
I want you to ask yourself this: if high unemployment exists, why don't wages instantly drop to create more jobs? In a purely mathematical, frictionless model, a surplus of workers should mean the price of labor drops immediately until everyone is hired. But clearly, looking out our windows, we know for a fact that doesn't happen. That's because wages are what economists call sticky. Imagine a local restaurant owner. If they arbitrarily cut their chef's pay by 20%, the chef's morale plummets and the food quality completely tanks. Actually, it hurts the firm more to cut wages than to just lay off a few workers and keep the remaining wages high. Add in coordination problems in union contracts where employed insiders hold bargaining power, and you can easily see why wages don't just plummet overnight.
So to summarize our final module here, the reality is that wages and prices adjust sluggishly. This means the economy relies on a slow, dynamic adjustment process rather than instant corrections. And because of this sluggishness, adverse events like oil price shocks can cause severe disruptions, trapping the economy in a painful adjustment period for months or even years.
Ultimately, human expectations drive this entire economic machine. If we all behave intelligently and anticipate the future, then our collective expectations are quite literally designing tomorrow's economic reality. So I'll leave you with this. How are your own expectations of inflation or job security changing the way you spend and save today? Thanks for joining me in this explainer, and keep questioning how our complex world works.